welcome tonight in our little discussion about books, classics, and all that.
Just a bit of fun. Good to see you, Norm. How are you?
It's brilliant to see you. I'm doing amazing. I had a long day, but I'm happy to be here and talk about Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Good old Fyodor. Yeah,
Good
we're
of you.
continuing the existentialists, it seems.
It looks like. I wanted to kick this off with actually a joke because you always try to bring in an icebreaker, and it was always a bit awkward. So I guess I'll add add something to this podcast with my awkwardness. Do you want to hear it?
For sure.
All right.
Go for it.
So Russian literature is built on suffering. Either a character suffers, the author suffers, or the reader suffers. If all three are suffering, then it's considered a Russian masterpiece.
I I guess that's true, right? Yeah. There's a
Would you
lot of.
confirm?
I mean, I haven't read that much Russian literature. I'm aware of the greats. I try to cherry pick a little bit. I read a bit of Dostoevsky, which we're discussing today a little bit
Mm-hmm.
as an initiation with notes from underground. I've read a bit of Tolstoy. I think Anna Karenina. I never ventured in War and Peace yet, and
Sure.
I tried Pushkin, I think, or Gogol a little
Yeah.
bit.
Pushkin Gogol.
Didn't
Yeah.
didn't quite get it. I think I was too young. All of the stuff, the Russian literature I was reading when I was 16, 17, I think I didn't have the maturity to appreciate the nuances.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, what's your experience with Russian literature?
I actually picked up the ones that you mentioned. I read Pushkin, Onegin from Pushkin. We read Gogol, The Nose. That was quite interesting. I read another one which was called The Seagull. I actually don't know if it was Russian or not. It might be someone else. But everyone has a Russian name. And everyone has a really long name, actually. And I
But I think
assume
that's a
that's Russian.
play, isn't it? That is a
It
play
is a
by
play. Yeah.
Pushkin, I believe.
Is that Pushkin? Could be. I'm not really
Chekhov,
sure.
sorry,
Anyway,
Chekhov.
Chekhov, yeah. So I read a bit of Chekhov. There was a bunch of other stuff. I guess Tolstoy wrote a lot of stories, a lot of shorter fairy tales, which I'm familiar with, but not
Hmm.
with any of his monumental work. That would be way too grinding to do. And I guess a bit of a follow up about Russian literature and as well as just literature to read. That's really difficult. I spent last week listening to Albert Camus' The Plague on audiobook, and I finished listening to it. And I found to be pretty good. It was surprisingly good. It was much better than I remember. And I,
What did you like about it? What's new? Because the last time we were really saying how much Camus sucks. I think that was our conclusion.
no.
No?
What I was saying, like, we are all jealous at his, playboy lifestyle. We
Oh,
don't
we are
really
all jealous.
get. Oh yeah, we all jealous. But yeah, he was a bit depressed, right? And the plague itself is very interesting, not only because it aligns well with a lot of the stuff we see in COVID, which I think just a credit to how well the author researched collective psychology and how people reacted to these diseases in the past. I mean, I'm not saying he was like a seer or a Nostradamus. I'm
Mm.
just saying he guessed it right.
Well, maybe there was still plague, wherever in Algeria when he was growing up, when people would just shut down in their homes for a few
Yeah,
months.
yeah, but very much. And interestingly, the idea of the plague, which is an actual plague, a bubonic plague and a pneumonic plague as well. So they have both in the books. They more or less follow the same authoritarian orders as we do in COVID. And a lot of the objections and a lot of the resistance and a lot of the fuck ups that happens around the story is similar to what we saw over the past year or two with COVID. So it kind of highlights how human nature in many ways is how they adopt essentially, right? How people go through mindsets from being surprised, willing to work together, then wanting to break out, then wanting to lie, then wanting to work together again, and so on. So it's very interesting and it's quite well done. The story has some twists and turns, which I found was pretty interesting. Although it could have came a bit earlier because the middle of the book was a bit too contemplative. I always find
Mm.
like you could cut maybe 100, 150 pages off of many of these books and it's still fine. Yeah,
That's a good point. Especially
that's
these anemic or the ones with anomia, where the
and no
whole
meat.
point is how much you're against the rules, how much you're building to the same case really over and over again, and the silence is part of the statement to some extent.
Oh
I
yeah,
don't think, luckily, and I'm actually relieved. I'm glad you liked The Plague. I'm relieved we're passing on to. I don't want to sound pompous, but what is effectively probably my one of my favorite writers, if not my most favorite writer, if I can say that, my favorite writer, which is good old Fyodor. And I think this is the first book, Notes from Underground, that I ever read from Dostoevsky. Now, in the meantime, my experience with Dostoevsky is kind of two stages. One, high school, and this was the only book that I read from Dostoevsky in high school. I didn't venture, tackling the huge volumes that you have by him, which are kind of like thousands or hundreds of pages, basically. I'm just looking for my Dostoevsky books. So he wrote a few things, right? Because he wrote, and I don't know exactly which order. I think the first one he wrote was The Idiot,
uh-huh. Good
and
cover.
yeah, and then I think a lot of people say that the Brothers Karamazov is his masterpiece. Although I think he basically, together with, he's got a few other ones. My favorite book is actually The Demons, and that's what I had this period. I think last year or the year before, I don't remember. To quote your L'étranger, where I actually read all of the all of those three big ones: the
Uh-huh.
Karamazov brothers, the Idiot, and the Demons. I believe those are the three ones. I might be missing
Mm.
one. All in one go, like in one go, half a year potentially, and it was really instructive. Now, this one, Notes from Underground, I read it when I was a teenager, and it's actually interesting for me to just think about the difference between being someone in my like 30-year-old versus a 16-year-old. It's really like double the time that I've had time to digest this. I think what struck me about the first book, Notes from Underground, it's a very small book. It's almost like a pamphlet. I think it was originally like 100 or 120 pages when I was reading it.
Two
Well,
parts.
yeah, and it was. I think I read it overnight. I just started reading it, and I might actually read from it because I really love the introduction. And
Yeah,
I
sure.
thought, this guy's fucking with me, or he's clearly joking. There's something weird about this. I can't. And then maybe I didn't pay enough attention to the disclaimer at the beginning, which is the author of the diary and the diary itself are, of course, imaginary. Nevertheless, it is clear that persons as the narrator actually exist, must exist in our society,
Sure.
and I've tried to expose that in the most public way. So he basically describes this public servant. Do you mind if I read the first paragraph? Because similar to your paragraph from the L'étranger, I think it's very representative of the whole book and the whole zeitgeist of
Sure. Why
Russia.
don't why don't first we just do a step back and just give us the overall synopsis of what the book is about? You don't have to spoil it or anything. Just the overarching idea, and then yeah, go ahead.
Well, as far as I remember, and I haven't read this recently, it takes the what is really innovative is takes the first person. So the narrator, talks in first person, and he basically is effectively, describing some of his internal conflicts and a small narrative about his experience in what is effectively Tsarist Russia. He's a public servant, and he feels the need to write a confession, and to some extent. and it's effectively an exploration of one's psyche ultimately, and the conflicts between the desire to do good, to be a righteous person, and the reality of one's actions,
Mhm.
which are all mixed up into all sorts of, I'd say, corruption of many sorts. Dostoevsky is the type of writer which has a very, very, I think, profound, as you said, Russian, almost Christian type of philosophy,
Yeah,
existentialist, but very different from Camus, because it really places the emphasis on, indeed, on some suffering. Life is suffering,
yeah.
and salvation to some extent. The search for salvation, and it has all his narratives are effectively an exploration of that. What he does really well is he creates really, really deep characters, and he
Hmm.
reveals their psychological tension. Um, I think,
So
yeah.
go for it. Go for the first
So
chapter.
what I was, imagine I was 16 when I was reading this, and it was probably like 10 in the evening, and I was reading. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I believe my liver is diseased. However, I know nothing of all at all about my disease, and do not know for certain what ails me. I don't consult a doctor for it, and never have, though I have a respect for medicine and doctors. In parentheses, I believe in science. Besides, I'm extremely superstitious, which is very typical actually of believing in science and being extremely superstitious at once, sufficiently so as to respect medicine anyway. I am well educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am superstitious. A lot of conflict right there. Now, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite, and that's
Mhm.
something potentially that we explored last time, that you probably will not understand. Well, I understand it though. Of course, I can't explain who is precisely that I am mortifying in this case by my spite. I am perfectly well aware that I cannot pay out the doctors by not consulting them. I know better than anyone that by all this I am only injuring myself and no one else. But still, if I don't consult a doctor, it is from spite. My liver is bad. Well, let it get worse.
This guy sounds fun. Well,
He's taking the
was
piss.
he drunk while doing this?
So, and then he goes on for 100 pages explaining how sick of a man and spiteful of a man he is, and he's really an exploration into his own anguish. Have you read or have you had a chance of reading any paragraphs on this?
Yeah, I listened to the first 4 or 5 chapters of the book. I admit I didn't want to ruin the book for myself, so I hoped you all give me a bit more insights. I collected some thoughts that I don't know how much of it is shit talking and how much of it is actual genuine insights, but I'll let you lead the conversation and then we can talk about it after.
Yeah, well, if I remember correctly, basically he goes on to talk about his life and his convictions, and he has basically desired to be righteous. And I think what happens through this exploration, which is just the pure narrative, it makes the delight of reading this book because it's so genuine. It's basically a confession of a man with whom it's very easy to identify, and at the same time, it's very easy to realize that is written with a lot of cynicism or
Yeah.
sarcasm or disgust at the same time of kind of the towards life in general, similar to the character in L'étranger. But I think this time you actually, whereas in the Étranger you couldn't really perceive what this person was doing. You could only see it from the outside. You could see this person wandering around, not being animated by anything, committing murder just to see what it's like. On the other hand, here you have a very spiteful man who's looking for, I guess he's looking to, yeah, he's committing an act of narcissism or psychological narcissism in a way by revealing what truly goes on in his mind, and he's taking a lot of pleasure out of that. And if you take a step back and you think of how Dostoevsky must be doing, he does an amazing job at actually impersonating a whole personality, right? And taking stances in through his characters. He's all his characters. In this case, he's probably this person, right, who feels this moral disgust towards his job as a petty public servant. He enjoys the power that such a position gives you in committing small acts of corruption and standing in the way of people's businesses. And I think there's a point towards the climax where, out of a desire to be virtue signaling, he claims to, or he intends to help. I think, believe maybe a prostitute, but I think he has the intention of helping. And when he promises this person to, well, promises some form of help, then he ends up just disappointing and committing more harm, which is again a very typical of someone that is just looking for self gratification and not genuinely caring about people.
I think he needs to see a psychologist, although he probably wouldn't out of spite.
Yeah, I think if you read this book, you actually go through a catharsis in itself, right? So if you're spiteful, you're exploring this feeling of spite. It really takes it to the extreme. It really,
I
yeah.
no, what I was saying, like from the first 4 or 5 chapters that I listened to, I had the impression that if this guy would have lived today, we wouldn't know if he's like a satire or is he does he actually mean it. And many people describe the guy as a troll. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but he's definitely an interesting guy. One thing I agree with him, right? One of the things he said, and I totally agree with him, is living beyond 40 is bad manners. I thought that was a very, very good idea. People that are older than 40 are, are just inappropriate.
I think there's no coincidence, right, that this happens in his 40s. And I assume he wrote it close to his 40s. I know he had a very tumultuous youth, right? He was animated by socialist thoughts to some extent. So there was this movement, I believe, around 48. Him and his mother mates got together, formed a kind of a extreme left-leaning association. I think some of them were plotting against the Tsar, and they eventually got caught.
Did he blow
And
some shit up?
um, no, they never managed to. But what happened was, so here's the interesting thing. I don't know if you know about this, but what happened was they got sent to Siberia
Hmm.
to a camp, and they were actually sentenced to death. Sorry, so initially sentenced to death, then sent to Siberia.
Wait, are we talking about Dostoevsky
Yeah,
himself? Okay,
yeah, himself.
go ahead.
Sorry, yeah,
Yeah, the author,
not the
not the
person,
character.
and kind of
Worth clarifying.
together with his friends, I think. And he was quite a, I think he was a well respected intellectual, or at least from a good family. And I think last minute he was put in front of a firing squad. I don't know if you know this. And then
Not
um,
pardon.
yeah, last minute. This was all the part of the plan. It was just to make him scared. And I think this produced a form of PTSD that later turned into some form of epilepsy, which explains his part of his genius, I think, in impersonating so many characters and understanding the deep psychology of each of them, taking it to its consequential end effectively, and letting the characters play out in these very complex ways.
I think this is a brilliant parental discipline. Like, little Kevin, my imaginary son is misbehaving. I'm like, Kevin, you're standing in front of the firing squad. Let's flip a coin, see if you're lucky this time. Wow, but it's very impressive. And funny thing that you talk about all these plot points from Dostoevsky's life itself. I mean, technically, it's not a plot point. This is what happened to him, because when it comes to notes from underground, every resource I'm reading online barely talks about the story. They talk about the implication, the character, the philosophy behind it, the idea around free will. Not so much about the prostitute story. And I think there's a point where he goes out to party and everyone hates him there. They never talk about that either. So there's definitely multiple layers there that are very interesting to discuss and read about.
I mean, there's so many levels that you can approach this, right? I was talking about his desire to do good, and then um, often his characters have this change of view, and it often brings their downfall. So, for instance, He's asking himself towards the end of the book, where had she gone and why was I running after her? Why? To fall before her feet, to sob with remorse, to kiss her feet, to entreat her forgiveness. So he has this rejection of some of the more he realizes effectively that maybe his feelings weren't really genuine, and
Yeah.
his desire to help was actually a lot of it was out of ego. And I think a lot of the characters go through this kind of struggle with their egos to some extent, and they get punished for it, or they punish themselves for it. And often they see reality as Dostoevsky calls it in one of the last sentences is a lot of these characters are either driven by almost like manic feelings, right? He's asking himself, what is better, cheap happiness or exalted sufferings?
Mhm.
There's nothing in between. That's the
And I
dichotomy
know
of
what I would pick.
it.
And honestly, when I was young and I was chasing girls, I didn't think this much about it at all.
No, I think when you reach 40, you start just putting it in words rather than.
Yeah, because your osteo is slowing you down, so you're like, I don't know if it's worth it. Fair enough. Fair enough. I find it quite interesting because they talk a lot about free will when discussing Notes from Underground, and there's this whole idea. At least they mention it in a few times in the first few chapters, is that people behave like twice two equals four, right? Like this guy really hates math for some reason. I
I
don't
just
know
love
why.
that.
And he talks about how the idea that you are sick, you have to go to the doctor gives you pills, you have to go to back home, and then you have to suffer and you have to lay in bed, and so on and so on and so on, is all connected steps that ultimately treads over your free will. It is not free will because it railroads you into doing what ultimately society wants you to do. So this guy paints himself as the rebel. He paints himself as the guy who is superior to this, and not go to the doctor in to spite this rule, to actually showcase that I have the right and I have the freedom to be stupid, and I can make these decisions, and that shows that I have free will.
I really like that, and I think this is probably the thing that fascinates me the most about Dostoevsky is that, as you say, this he's really exploring the concept of free will and consciousness, and I think he even has conscious written in bold in some of his paragraphs as I'm
Mhm.
sort of looking through. But I wanted to read that element of the piano key because I think it's just so dramatic. If I can find it.
That's okay. I don't really think it's necessary unless you really want to. It's fine. Um, and
Well,
in terms,
just that sentence around, you know,
so do you think that while you're searching for it, do you think that his concept of free will is like valid? Does it make sense to you, or it will lead me to another question? But let's focus on that for now.
I think. Sorry, can you repeat the question? In what way do you mean is
Does his
valid?
concept of free will, as in twice two equals four, people are just following, rules instead of having free will, and to spite something is free will. This whole concept, do you think it makes sense? Like, would it make
Well,
sense in today's world?
I think what he's contrasting there to me is, yeah, it's. I think, well, he's putting something against something. One is just like many people in modern Russia at the time. There was a fascination with science to some extent, and science offering answers to everything. And the beauty of science is just like when you press a piano key, you know exactly what sound is going to come out. And then he's taking this to its logical conclusion to some extent is that if everything is materialistic, ultimately deterministic,
Yeah,
you do A leads to B. Where's the room for humans effectively? What is it to be
yeah,
human in a world that's all material?
fair
He's
enough.
questioning that, and basically, what he's trying to to pit against that is actually a person that, through his own spiteness, through his own emotion, disgust, stands against determinism and materialism and says, nothing can happen without my will, or everything can happen with my will. And therefore, uh, me as a human, as a conscious person, I can trump science. I can shape my world, right, in whatever way I want, and it's sometimes to the most harmful consequences, sometimes to the best ones. And I think he's really exploring kind of the worst that he can do in his petty little universe. And
Yeah.
it is an interrogation of what is truly materialistic. That's definitely out
Yeah.
there. And he basically, when he resembles himself to piano key that you just press, and he really insists basically that he is not a piano key. He's something else.
I'm not a key.
I'm not just a
That
key. I'm not just a
I'm not
pawn.
just a key. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I guess I found it interesting because I think from one end it brings up a good question around how materials, including your own body, restricts your own free will. I mean, just going back to the sickness, if you're sick, you have to go to the doctor so you can cure yourself. I mean, your brain, even if you don't fully understand what a doctor is, you still have the same stimuli throwing at you that you want to cure yourself. So I guess as long as you are within a human body and you are not just a soul floating around, do you really have the free will? And I think that's the interesting bit. The other thing where I think was somewhat erroneous on his end, on the characters and not necessarily on Dostoevsky's end, is that he defined his freedom almost in relation to others. So he was often, from what I understand, was trying to do what others are not doing because he felt superior to them. And that I think creates almost a fallacy where you have to do what others are don't do, but in a sense that determines what you are doing. Does that make sense?
Are we talking about Dostoevsky as a person, as a writer, or
No, the book.
but the actual character in the book?
Character in the book. So, a character in the book said, well, implied at least, he doesn't want to do things that others are doing because others are inferior to him. He was thinking a lot about hierarchies. And he defined, or at least implied, that his free will be the opposite of what others are doing. But the issue with that is that when you define yourself in that framework that you do what others are not doing, you are you are really limiting yourself, and in many ways you are determining what you will be doing.
I
Is
think
that
that's
does make
that's just amazing, and how he actually, as I said, he's just a genius in how he creates these constructs, right? He's letting a character kind of play around with that, and as you say, differentiate himself, only to fall into the trap of conformism,
yeah,
which is an indication of anything that if you position yourself against other people, no matter what your ideology is, you are kind of boxing yourself in.
yeah,
So when you're responding with ideology to ideology, you're gonna find yourself in a rigid framework that is sort of deterministic. And I think that's what he's trying to contrast, is effectively being human is stepping beyond that and not relating yourself to other people in this
yeah,
case, but relating yourself to your individual, and you as yourself as an individual. One thing that comes across, maybe doesn't come across from this book, but is most deep concept of Dostoevsky, is that of kind of personal responsibility. It's a bit explored here because the character tries to take responsibility for himself, clearly fails, tries to
mm,
get responsibility for someone else, this woman, Liza, at the end, and fails miserably, triggering more remorse. And I think you see this in more mature books from him. The characters failing to take responsibility suffer a lot. And the voluntary taking up of responsibility leads to some form of sort of salvation, which is obviously, you can recognize the pattern. It's the typical Christian pattern. But he arrives at this through the narrative and letting things play out to some extent. And that's kind of the only answer that you find. I think Notes from Underground is really raising a lot of questions, and it's probably the most appropriate introduction to Dostoevsky because it just raises all sorts of issues that then the rest of his work are just exploring and trying to come up with answers. And the beauty of Dostoevsky is that you can't really, it doesn't give you the answer. It just gives you a narrative that you have to play in your head by embodying all these characters, the worst possible, like the character in this in Notes from Underground, and letting yourself feel that, and realizing what it does to you, and being in accord with its resorts, with its with its drivers effectively, and then seeing where that leads you. And then basically the answer is, after you've read through, you actually have the opportunity of saying, this was me as well, as a human being. I am spiteful, I am cynical, I don't help people, I actually am evil sometimes. Evil is part of my life, I can do harm. What am I going to do about it? This is clearly a reality, right? So I think that's the beauty of a good book, like any book from Dostoevsky, is that it leaves. It's not just a book in itself; it's everything that comes after you've been through that is truly transformative.
I mean, raising questions that you don't answer. I don't know if that says it to me, honestly.
Well, it's
Sometimes
not.
I just want answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you, and it's almost like a meta answer, because the answer comes from the playing out of the narrative. So you want to be righteous, you want to help someone, here you go, and you try to be righteous, and then you realize, why was I doing this? I was
Yeah.
only doing it for self gratification. It makes me feel sick about myself. And then you feel like you're abandoning a person, and the result of that is that you realize where some of your motivation comes from,
Yeah.
and where it can lead you.
O-
um,
on the lighter note, I was, again, just based on the first few chapters, there was a bit where he talks about how he goes out, does mean stuff, and then comes home and feels embarrassed, and that embarrassment kind of becomes pleasure. So I was thinking, is this guy just like an unaware BDSM fan? Is this guy just needs like a visit from Mistress XYZ and just, you know, get a bit of get a bit of treatment for a few $100? I'm sure he would feel better afterwards, right? He would get a bit happier.
Well, I think that's kind of what he's is probably implied, right? Because he's animated by all sorts of feelings.
Yeah.
Amour propre, so love for oneself, and yeah, as I said, self-righteousness. He's he feels that he should be the person of truth.
Yeah.
And he wants to feel animated by truth, and then he's also animated by desire. I guess in the end, right? He probably, that's what drives him towards this woman, and
Yeah.
he doesn't recognize it until the very end, and then feels disgusted with himself, as you would probably, right?
Yeah.
The problem is that it's all kind of shallow.
Yeah.
Everything
Yeah.
is
True.
truly really shallow.
Well, no, that's fine. I think many ways it does represent many of us as human beings because we have different reasons doing things, and human beings are capable of doing evil things or things that they do for themselves, but ultimately will harm others. Right? We can dwell on this for hours. It is really, or very much, a very interesting, very in-depth description of how human beings operate. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
The on
there's a whole psychology in this, though. Perhaps it is simply that I am a coward. And perhaps
Yeah,
that's again related to the lack of responsibility, which is the essence of the answer in Dostoevskian philosophy. And perhaps that I purposely imagine an audience before me in order that I may be more dignified while I write in this case.
yeah,
There are perhaps thousands of reasons. Again, what is my object precisely in doing anything, such as writing? It is not for the benefit of the public. Why should I not simply recall these incidents in my own mind without putting them on paper? Why do anything, basically, is kind of the question, right? What's the point? If I'm just doing it for self gratification, for other people's use, does it even matter?
yeah,
It's clearly shallow. I think, and that's, you can tell that there's an underlying thing, that probably the answer is, take responsibility, do something for its own sake, or for the benefit of people, and not necessarily for how people feel about it. And I think that's again the hidden answer in everything. But it never gives you the answer. You always have to read beyond the text.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, we can probably wrap this up. One more thing I'd say, like I expected way more mentions of basements and actual underground areas in the book, but I did not find any. So it's 0 out of 5 for me. Otherwise, yeah, I'd recommend the book for everyone to read.
I'm glad we talked about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else we want to discuss?
No, I think that's it. It's
Fair enough.
awesome.
Oh, good stuff. For next week, I haven't really come up with anything. I have multiple ideas. I guess I'll just I'll just ping you something over.
All good, all good.
All right.
Look forward to talking again. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let's finish this.